Hello and welcome to this breakdown video of this Tightrope project that I made. It's a little sample project. If you want to download it yourself, you can do that for free. The link is in the description. Feel free to use it however you want, modify it however you want. If you want to implement it in your own project, feel free to do that. In this video, I'm just going to go over kind of how it works. It's not going to be a full tutorial, but I'll just go through the general process of how the blueprint works. So if you open up this file, in here you'll have level prototyping. You don't need to touch that. That's just everything in this level. You can go into this third person folder. The blueprints, I have gone into their default third person character blueprint here, and I just replaced the mannequin with a little capsule thing. So if I start playing here, then that's what this is. Just a little capsule guy. But the meat of this video will be going into this blueprint here, the Tightrope blueprint. The first thing that happens when you drop the blueprint into the world is it just appears here like this. So let's see exactly what it's doing. So let's start by going over the components of this blueprint. I have a spline, so that controls the look of the rope. I have an end post, I have a start post. I have an arrow which helps me keep track of the vectors. I have a trace box which we'll get into later, but that controls when I want to detect the player and when I don't. This midpoint is the point that the player attaches to when you land on the tightrope. And then this physics constraint is what makes the tightrope look like a rope. So those are all the components. Let's get into the code. So on construction, I set the end post location. So that's just the relative location, and that's controlled by a variable. The variable is visible as a 3D widget. So in here, you'll have this little thing here, and you can move it around, and the tightrope will adjust. The end post will adjust. Everything will adjust. That's based on the end post location variable. Next, I set the arrow rotation. So that's just calculating the rotation that the arrow needs to be in by using the end post location and start post location. So that points this arrow starting at the start point at the end point, and it stays like that. After that, I set the midpoint location, which I just set it in the middle. So I calculate the distance between the start and end point and then put it in the middle. Pretty straightforward using vectors. After that, I set the bounciness. So the bounciness is controlled by the physics constraint here. So this physics constraint has all free limits here, linear limits, and then all angular limits are locked. And then I have a motor, a linear motor here, just in the Z direction with a strength of 1000. This strength here controls the bounciness. So that's controlled by this variable here that feeds into this position strength. The higher this number, the more rigid the rope will be. The lower the number, the more it will move around. Actually, I'll just show you here. So right now it's set to 1000. If instead I set that to, say, 100, and then run it. And then if I set it to 5,000, I found that 1000 is a good value. It kind of depends on the mass of your player. So if you have a set mass, then it'll change this number. After the bounciness, I set the orientation of the physics constraint that's necessary for if you have weird oriented tightropes. So without this step, it works just fine if it's a straight tightrope. But if you have angles, weird angles, stuff like that, then you'll need this step to kind of make it work still. And then after that, I spawn the rope, so all the visuals of the rope, and that includes the spline and also the spline mesh. So I spawn the spline first by clearing the spline out and then adding the start spline at the start point, the middle spline point just at the midpoint location, and then the last spline point is at the end point. And then I set all of them to linear because I don't really care about the tangent information. I don't need it to be a curve. I just need it to be a straight line. And then once I have my spline set, I need to spawn my spline mesh. So I clear out any of the spline mesh that already exists. There shouldn't be anything, but I just do that anyway. And then I add the spline mesh component, and I set the position and tangents of the spline mesh component. So that creates the visual part of the rope. And then after that, I set the trace box location, rotation, and size. So the trace box, which I will again get more into a little bit later, but that's this box here. You can see kind of like the outline here. It just goes around the rope a little bit, but again, we'll get to that later. It's important that it encompasses the rope though, so that's what that step does. It just makes sure that the trace box encompasses the rope. And to do that, I just set the location rotation and then set the box extents. And that's everything that's happening in the construction script. Now we can go to the event graph. Now at begin play, I set some variables and I start a timer. I'll get to this timer later. But the meat of this blueprint is right here on tick. And I know you shouldn't really use tick, but I've put in these gates to limit when I'm using tick and when I'm not. So I'll open and close these as I need. But the main thing here is this line trace player channel. So click into this. I have a line trace going and it's trying to detect a channel called player. So I have created a trace channel called player. Everything ignores it except for the player. And this just shoots from the start point in the direction of the arrow to the end point. So just end to end of the rope. And then I have this little edge offset thing just so that it doesn't go right to the post. It goes kind of like a little offset from it so you don't run into the post. If that line trace detects something, it detects as a hit. If not, it doesn't. But if it detects as a hit, then it activates this land on Tightrope node. It also depends on the player Z velocity, because I didn't want the player to get stuck to the tightrope if they're jumping up. I only want it to happen if they're falling onto the tightrope. So I have this little, if it's less than 100 velocity, then it activates. Otherwise it doesn't. It also doesn't activate if the player is already on the tightrope, because that wouldn't make any sense. But if all those conditions are met, then it activates this land on tightrope node, which brings us here. So to begin with, I close the line trace gate, so that just means it stops trying to detect the player because it already found the player. I open the update rope gate. So if we go back there, on tick I have this other branch here, open update rope gate, and this is just update rope. So this is just updating the spline position and also updating the spline mesh. That's just visually so that it looks like the rope is moving how it should. So that's what this open update rope gate is. Next, I snap the midpoint location to wherever the line trace hit, because that's where the player is going to attach to, and I want that to be where the player is. So I snap it over. And then I attach the player to the rope using that midpoint. So first I have to set the player movement to none so that the player doesn't fall anymore. And then I snap the player to the midpoint. I snap just the location. I keep the world rotation, world scale. And then this player snap location, go into there, it's basically just snapping the player's feet to the rope instead of the middle of the player. So I'll show you. If I disconnect this, but if I reattach it, so that step is just readjusting so that it looks a little better. This player snap rotation isn't completely necessary. It just decides which way the player should be facing on the tightrope when you land on it. It still looks okay without it, I think, but I prefer with it on, so you can play around with that. If you want to try without it, you can just disconnect it and see what it looks like, but that's what that does. So now the player is attached to the rope. After that, I disable the player collision. I mainly do that because now that the player is in a movement mode of none, if you bump into things, it kind of like messes things up and you just float away, which we don't want. So I avoid that by not letting you bump into things. I set the collision response channels for world static and physics body just to ignore for the player. After that, I apply a downward impulse to the rope, or I apply it to the midpoint actually. And this is just to make it look bouncy when you jump on it. That's why it bounces when I jump on it. Without this, you'll still jump on it, it just won't bounce. This stop move has to do with, I'll get into a little more later, but it has to do with the movement on the tightrope, the movement system that I have. It just stops you, it basically resets the movement input so that you don't move. And then next I have this variable called isOnTightrope. This is basically just to let the blueprint know if the player is on the tightrope or not. It comes in handy later so that I can turn things on and off if I don't need them. And then this bind events to player dispatcher takes us over here. And this blueprint here is all the way at the bottom. But this is basically how I control movement on the tightrope. Since we changed the movement mode to none, none of your normal controls will work anymore. So this is how I kind of get around that. So I'll open up the character blueprint right now to show you how I have it set up. So it's the default third person character setup. And in the movement input, I have added these event dispatchers. I called it start move dispatcher and stop move dispatcher. If you don't know how event dispatchers work, they basically just send out a signal just generally to activate events, and only things that are listening for this dispatcher get activated. So I call the event dispatcher here, but then in the tightrope, I need to tell it to start listening to this dispatcher. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm binding the event to this dispatcher. So that happens when you land on the tightrope, then this gets activated, which means that when you're on the tightrope, you can still move and stuff. So in the character, I have that on the movement input. I also have it on the jump input here. I have this jump dispatcher. And then I have one on this cancel action that I put here, which is bound to the C key, if you're wondering when you're playing around with it. That cancels being on the tightrope. If you're walking on the tightrope, pushing C will actually just drop you from the tightrope. Jumping will obviously make you jump from the tightrope, and then moving will make you move back and forth on the tightrope. And then obviously stop move will make you stop moving. Down here, I have a similar thing, but this is unbind events from player dispatcher, which means I'm disconnecting all of these from the actor. The reason I want to do that is because if I jump off of the tightrope, I don't want it to move around anymore, because if I keep that on, then the rope will keep on moving without me on it, and it'll look weird. So I unbind them so that it just goes back to normal, and it just uses the player's normal movement input. So that's what happens when you land on the tightrope. That's all this stuff on tick I think we just covered. Down here, is the trace box. So I said we get into this later. This is later. Basically, it's finding the player when the player overlaps with it. If the player does overlap with it, then it'll open the line trace gate, which is what tries to detect the player. And then if you end overlap with the trace box, then it will close the line trace gate, so it'll stop trying to find the player. That's how I kind of limit my use of tick and this line trace here. If you're really far away from the tightrope, there's no need for it to try to find you because you're not going to hit it. So it really only tries to find you if you're right next to it. So that's what the trace box is. Down here I have the jump input. So this is linked to that dispatcher. When you hit the jump button while you're on the tightrope, it will unbind all the events so that they're not activated while you're jumping in the air because you're not attached to the tightrope anymore. I detach the player from the rope. So here that's just detaching the actor. And then here I reset the rotation of the player. So like if the tightrope is really inclined here like this, you won't stay inclined when you detach from it. You'll like level out. If you don't do that, then when you land on the ground, you'll still be inclined and it'll look weird. So you gotta reset the rotation. So after I detach the player, I enable the player collision. That's just doing what I did before, but the opposite. So world static and physics body are now block for the player. And then I make the player jump. So how I do this is I set the player movement to falling again. So gravity will affect them again. And then I set the velocity of the player. So the Z velocity is dictated by whatever the jump Z velocity is set for your character. And then that's added onto the X and Y components of however you're pushing the analog stick. If you're like moving, if you're pushing to move in one direction, then this part here will push you in that direction. Basically, you just jump to the side instead of jumping straight up, is what this whole thing does. And then as you jump, I apply another downward impulse to the midpoint. You can adjust this strength if you think it's too strong or too weak. It'll just make it a little bouncier or less bouncy. But this just makes it look like you're jumping off of the rope because it bounces. This, I tell it you're no longer in the tightrope, and then I reset all the movement variables. So if I click on this, then it's just setting this input X and input Y to 0. And then I'll cover this later. After I stop move, I have this thing that opens the line trace gate. So you start looking for the player again, but I have this delay here because if you don't have this, then it'll just immediately detect the player again and you'll just be stuck to the tightrope. So this delay prevents that from happening. And then down here, I have a node that closes the update rope gate, because if you're not on the tightrope anymore, it doesn't need to update its look anymore. But also I put this delay here because you don't want it to stop right away, otherwise it'll just immediately get stuck and it'll look weird. You want it to bounce around a little bit first and then it can stop after that. So I put a 1 second delay. So that's jumping off of the tightrope. Below that I have dropping from the tightrope. So this is that cancel button that I was talking about. It's basically the exact same thing as jumping, but the one difference is instead of this jump from rope node, I have this drop from rope node, and it's the same thing. You change the movement mode to falling, but you don't have this whole set the velocity thing after it. It just drops the player. And then I apply a downward impulse again, but this time it's a little weaker. I think everything else on this path is exactly the same as jumping. Down here for movement on the tightrope, so these values come from the dispatcher. I feed them in from my player character, and those set input variables. This little branch here detects whether the spot that I'm going to get moved to is within the bounds of the tightrope, because I don't want to go outside of the bounds because then I'll just be walking on nothing. This kind of calculates that. and says yes or no, am I in the bounds? If I'm not in the bounds, it stops me from moving. But if I am in the bounds, then it will move me to that spot. Or it moves the midpoint to the spot, and I'm attached to the midpoint. That's how that works. This next one here sets the midpoint rotation. So that's just if you're on the tightrope, you want the player to be like turning around in the correct orientation. So you want to be turning around. That's what that node does. So you're not just pointing in one direction the whole time. And that's based on the direction that you're moving. And then I have this open footstep gate, which I had briefly talked about before, but I'll get more into it now. Technically, this is kind of unnecessary for most cases, probably. The reason I have it here is if I click on it, it goes down to here. This is all set by a timer that I had set up on begin play here, this footstep timer. It loops every 0.3 seconds. And the point of this is I apply a downward impulse to the midpoint just every 0.3 seconds because it's kind of mimicking a footstep if you're walking. Normally, you would set this up to be connected with your animation blueprint. That's how I have it set up in mine. So I basically set up an anim notify that sets off an event in here, and that event activates this downward impulse. But because this is kind of a bare bones thing and I don't have any animations, I just set it to a timer instead, just to like simulate it. So for the most part, you probably won't need this, but that's what this is. So that's what happens when you move, not too complicated. And then the stop move just resets everything. So it zeroes out all your input variables and then it closes the footstep gate. And that's, I think, everything in this blueprint. Again, this file is available for you to download for free. The link for that will be in the description. You can use it however you want. You don't need to credit me. You can change it if you want, do whatever you want with it. And if you have questions about it, you can either, I guess, leave a comment down below. I'll try to answer them. No promises that I can answer every single question, but I can try. Or you can go to my Discord. I'll put that link in the description where you can ask me a little more directly some questions there. And some other people in my Discord might be able to help you too if they have solved the problem that you're having. And if you want to check out the game that I'm working on that spawned this whole tightrope thing, it's called Nectar. I'm doing a whole devlog series about it, so you can check out my channel there. I have a corresponding video with this video, so you can check that out. I'll probably put that link in the description too. Thanks.